Good evening, traveller. Welcome back. Come now, pull your chair a little closer to the fire. That's it. The flames have been burning steadily this evening, and the warmth has settled deep into the stones around us. You can feel it, I think. That comfortable kind of heat that doesn't press against you, but simply holds you, like a hand resting gently on your shoulder. I'm glad you've returned to Camelot tonight. Outside, the last light of the sun has given way to a deep and quiet sky. The kind of sky that only comes in the later hours, when the stars have fully committed to their places and the world below has grown still. The wind has softened. The torches along the outer walls burn without flickering. And the castle itself seems to breathe slowly, the way a place does when it has finally found its rest for the evening. You may have noticed on your way here tonight how different Camelot feels after dark. In the daylight, it is a place of movement, of purpose. Boots on cobblestone, horses in the yard, voices calling across the courtyard. There is always something happening, always something being done. But at this hour, all of that falls away. What remains is something harder to describe. A presence, perhaps. A weight that isn't heavy, but simply there, the way a great tree is there, or an old river. Camelot at night reminds you of everything it has witnessed, everything it holds within its walls. And tonight, I would like to bring you deeper into those walls. Tonight, I would like to take you somewhere I have spent a great many evenings of my life. If you are comfortable, and I believe you are, then let us leave the warmth of this fire for just a moment. Let us walk together through the corridor that leads from these quiet outer rooms toward the heart of the castle. The stones beneath our feet are smooth here, worn by years of passing footsteps. The torches along the wall are spaced just far enough apart that the light between them is soft, almost golden. The kind of light that asks nothing of your eyes. We pass beneath an archway now. The ceiling rises above us. And there, at the end of the corridor, two great doors stand slightly open. Warm light spills through the gap between them. And beyond those doors, the sound of the fire within is deep and steady, larger than the one we left behind. We have arrived at the great hall. I will pause here for just a moment, as I always do. Even now, after all these years, something happens to me when I stand at this threshold. Something quiet and difficult to name. It is not awe exactly, though there is some of that. It is more like recognition, the feeling of returning to a place that has shaped you and knowing it. Come, let us go inside. The great hall of Camelot is not what most people imagine when they first hear of it. Those who have never visited tend to picture something grand to the point of coldness. Towering ceilings, echoing stone, a room designed more to impress than to welcome. A room that reminds you of your smallness. But that is not this room. Yes, the ceiling is high. Yes, the walls are thick and old, cut from the same pale stone that makes up the rest of the castle. And yes, there is a grandeur here that cannot be denied. But it is a warm grandeur, a lived-in grandeur. Long banners hang from the upper walls, deep red and gold, their edges soft with age. The fireplace at the far end of the room is enormous, easily the largest I have ever known, and tonight it burns magnificently. Its light reaches every corner, casting long shadows that shift and breathe with the movement of the flames. Iron chandeliers hang above us, their candles adding to the glow, so that the whole room seems lit, not from any single source, but from within, the way an ember looks when you hold it close. The floor is stone, but covered in places with thick woven rugs in dark greens and earthy browns. Along the walls, wooden benches and tables wait quietly. High-backed chairs are arranged near the fire for those who wish to sit and think, or speak, or simply rest. And at the center of all of it, taking up the heart of the room as naturally as a great oak takes up the center of a clearing, is the table, the round table. I want you to look at it for a moment. Really look at it. It is made of oak, Old oak, the kind that has darkened over time to the color of deep earth. The grain of the wood is visible even from here, sweeping in long, quiet lines across its surface. It is large enough that a man could walk its full circle in a good number of steps, large enough to seat dozens of nights with comfort, large enough that when you stand beside it, you feel it as a presence rather than simply an object. But none of that is what makes it remarkable. What makes the round table remarkable is what it does not have. It has no head, no seat of greater importance than another, no place reserved for rank or title or the thickness of a man's purse. Every seat at this table is the same seat. Every man who sits here arrives as an equal. The king himself sat no higher, no further from the fire, no more prominently than the knight beside him. I remember the first time this was explained to me. I was young then, younger than I care to admit on most evenings. And the man who explained it to me did so simply, without ceremony, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. He said, "A circle has no beginning and no end. Every point on its edge is equal to every other. That is not a coincidence. That is the point." I have thought about those words many times since. There are not many ideas in this world that, once you truly understand them, change the way you see everything else. But that one did. The idea that the shape of a table could carry a meaning, that the way men sat together could say something about who they believed themselves to be and who they were willing to become. Arthur understood this. It was his table, his idea, and I think it was perhaps the finest thing he ever built, and he built a great many fine things. But a table, however beautifully made, is only wood and grain and age. What made the round table what it truly was, what filled it with meaning and gave it life, were the men who sat around it. And that is what I would like to tell you about tonight. Not the battles, not the great quests, though those are stories worth telling, and we will tell them in time. Tonight, I want to tell you about the men themselves, as I knew them, as I remember them, the sound of their laughter, the particular way a man carries himself when he believes in something, the small moments that, when added together, tell you more about a person than any tale of heroism ever could. I knew these men. I sat beside them at this very table. I shared meals with them and quiet evenings, and the particular kind of silence that only exists between people who trust one another. So settle in, traveller. Let the fire do what fires do. And let me tell you about the knights of the Round Table. Come, stand here with me for a moment, just here, beside the table, close enough to rest your hand upon it, if you like. Go on. That is real oak beneath your fingers. Old oak, the kind that has been standing so long it has forgotten what it was like to be a tree. Even after all these years, I still find myself doing exactly what you are doing now. Resting my hand here for a moment, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips, remembering. Before I tell you about the men who gathered around this table, I think you ought to understand the table itself, not its size, nor the skill of the craftsmen who built it, remarkable though their work was. No, what matters most is what this table was meant to say. Before Arthur, the great halls of Britain were arranged much the same. At the far end stood the high table, raised above all the others. It was there the king, or the lord of the hall, would sit while everyone else stretched away in long rows beneath him. A man's place was decided before he ever took his seat, by his birth, by his title, by the standing of his family. The hall itself told you exactly where you belonged. Arthur looked upon that custom, and something about it troubled him. He believed a hall arranged in such a way could never truly become a brotherhood. For when one man is always placed above the rest, it becomes easy for him to think himself greater than he is, and just as easy for another to believe he is worth less. Neither belief serves a good man. So Arthur chose something different, a circle, simple enough to look upon, yet quietly revolutionary. No seat above another, no place reserved for pride. Only brothers gathered together. Many have called it a small gesture over the years, merely a different shape carved from the same timber. I have never agreed, for a table cannot make a man honourable. Wood has never possessed that kind of power. But every time a knight took his place here, he was reminded of something worth remembering. Honour was not inherited. It was earned, again and again, day after day. A seat at this table belonged to no man simply because of his name, not because of the victories of his father, not because songs had already been written about him. It belonged to the man who proved himself worthy of sitting among his brothers, not only with courage upon the battlefield, but with kindness when no one was watching, with honesty when the truth carried a cost, with mercy toward those who could offer nothing in return, with loyalty to the man seated beside him. That was the heart of Camelot. Not perfection, never perfection. Before we go any further, I should tell you something plainly. I knew these men. I laughed with them, rode beside them, shared countless meals in this very hall, and because I knew them, I can tell you they were not perfect. They argued, they made mistakes. Some carried burdens so heavy they never truly laid them down. Some wounded those they loved. Others struggled quietly with doubts they rarely spoke aloud. They were, each of them, wonderfully human. Perhaps that is why I remember them with such affection. For their greatness did not lie in never falling short. It lay in rising again, in choosing, time and again, to become better than they had been the day before. That, I think, is a far nobler thing. Listen, can you hear it? Only the fire now. The hall has long since fallen quiet, yet sometimes, standing here, if I close my eyes, I can almost hear them again. The laughter, the easy conversation, a chair scraping across the stone floor, someone teasing Gawain across the table, Arthur smiling without saying a word. Strange, isn't it? For all the legends that have grown around Camelot, those are the memories I treasure most. Not the battles, not the triumphs, simply old friends gathered together at the end of another day. The candles have burned a little lower while we've been talking. The fire still burns warmly beside us, and I believe the evening is ready for the stories that remain. Come, sit with me. I'd like you to meet the men who filled these chairs, not as legends, not as names preserved in old manuscripts, but as I knew them, as they truly were. For a little while longer, let us remain beside the table. There is something about this place that has always invited memory. Perhaps it is the worn oak beneath our hands, or the quiet that settles over the hall once the voices have faded. Even now, I find it difficult to stand here without expecting the doors to open, without expecting familiar footsteps to echo across the stone. Strange, isn't it? A place may grow silent, yet never truly feel empty. There was a chair just here. Yes, along this side of the table. For reasons I could never quite explain, Lancelot almost always found his way to it. Whether he chose it deliberately or simply settled there out of habit, I cannot say. None of us ever thought to ask. It simply became his place. I shall do my best to describe him as I first knew him, though I suspect that is no easy task. For a first impression of Lancelot had a curious way of lasting a lifetime. He was tall, not so tall that he dominated a room, only enough that your eye naturally found him. He moved with a quiet grace that seemed almost effortless. Yet anyone who has spent years with a sword knows better than to mistake such ease for natural talent alone. Movements like his are earned, slowly, patiently, one ordinary day after another. What most people noticed first, however, were his eyes. Dark, thoughtful, always attentive, not searching the room for advantage, simply present. He had a way of listening that made you feel, if only for a few moments, that nothing else in the world required his attention. It is a rare gift, rarer, I think, than skill with a blade. When he was deep in thought, he would rest one hand upon his cup and slowly turn it beneath his fingers, round and round, never hurried. His eyes would drift somewhere beyond the hall. Then, As quietly as he had wandered away, he would return. He would look up, and somehow you always knew he had heard every word. I remember watching him speak with a young stable boy one winter evening. The conversation could not have lasted more than a minute or two. Yet several weeks later, Lancelot asked after the boy's mother, remembering she had been unwell. The lad looked almost startled that someone like Lancelot would remember such a thing. Lancelot seemed surprised anyone thought he would forget. That was the sort of man he was. People often remember his victories. I remember his attention, his kindness, the way he carried other people's burdens as though they mattered nearly as much as his own. Yet I would be doing him a disservice if I painted too peaceful a picture. Lancelot carried a weight within him. Even then, I could see it. Some burdens come from the world. Others, we quietly place upon ourselves. He held himself to a standard few men could ever reach. On the days he fell short, he rarely needed another soul to remind him. Some stories deserve to be told in their proper time. His is one of them. So tonight, I shall leave that part untouched. Instead, I will simply tell you this. People have asked me, more times than I could ever count, whether the stories told about Lancelot are true. I always smile before I answer, for the stories are impressive enough. Yet, somehow, they never quite reach the man himself. He was the finest knight I ever knew, not only because of what he accomplished, but because beneath every victory was a man who never stopped trying to become worthy of the gifts he had been given. Now, across from Lancelot sat another dear friend, Sir Gawain, Arthur's nephew. If Lancelot inspired admiration, Gawain inspired confidence. He possessed a steadiness that settled over a room almost without anyone noticing. When difficult news arrived, and difficult news had an unfortunate habit of finding Camelot, it was remarkable how often eyes drifted toward Gawain. Not because he always had the answer, but because he never surrendered himself to panic. I remember one council in particular. The hall had grown louder with every passing minute. Opinions crossed one another like swords. Some spoke from fear, others from pride. Arthur listened patiently through it all. Gawain said nothing. Not at first. He simply listened, one hand resting upon his cup, watching, considering. Only when every other voice had finished did he finally speak. Quietly. I confess, after all these years, I cannot remember his exact words. Time has carried them away. What I remember is what followed. The room became still. Arguments faded. Not because anyone had been defeated, but because Gawain possessed the rare ability to remind people of what truly mattered. That was his gift. Not brilliance, not spectacle, steadiness. He laughed often. He enjoyed good company. He spoke plainly, never decorating his thoughts simply to impress those around him. And his loyalty. His loyalty was something I admired all my life. Not the easy loyalty that asks nothing of a man, the costly kind, the sort that remains after disappointment, after grief, after hope has been tested again and again. He stayed. Again and again. He stayed. These days, people speak often of courage on the battlefield. There is certainly courage in charging toward danger. I have seen it with my own eyes, but I have come to believe there is another kind of courage, quieter, less celebrated, the courage to remain faithful, to continue showing up, to keep believing in something after it has become difficult. Gawain possessed that courage in abundance. When I close my eyes now, I do not first remember tournaments or victories. I remember this hall, the firelight dancing across a polished oak, Lancelot listening with quiet attention, Gawain smiling at some joke from the far end of the table, Arthur watching over us all with that familiar look of quiet satisfaction. For a little while, everything was as it ought to be. Those evenings have long since passed, yet standing here beside this old table, they never seem very far away. There are some men whose names arrive before they do. Long before they ever pass through the gates of Camelot, stories have already made the journey for them. By the time you finally meet them, it almost feels as though you already know them. People speak of their victories, their courage, their strength. Sometimes those stories prove true, sometimes they do not. Then there are others, men who arrive quietly, men whose names mean very little at first. No great songs announce them, no famous deeds follow at their heels. They simply arrive. And over time, almost without anyone noticing, they become the sort of men songs are eventually written about. Those men were always my favorites to watch. You see, it is a wonderful thing to witness greatness. But I have always believed it is an even greater privilege to witness someone becoming great. That was Percival. I still remember the first time I saw him. Though, if I'm being truthful, I cannot remember the season. For years, I believed it had been spring. Now, no. I think it must have been autumn. Yes. The mornings had begun to turn cool, and the leaves beyond the western wall had just started to change. Funny how the years blur together. The small details wander off first. Yet somehow the important ones stay. Percival was young, younger than many who came seeking a place among Arthur's household. There was an openness about him. He looked at the world with the curiosity of someone who still believed every question deserved asking. He was never embarrassed by what he did not know. I have always admired that in a man. Many people spend their lives pretending to possess wisdom. Percival never felt the need to pretend. He was content simply to learn. He was not polished. Courtly customs sometimes puzzled him. There were occasions when he spoke a heartbeat too soon, or misunderstood the room entirely. A few of the older knights would smile, never cruelly, never with mockery, only with the quiet affection reserved for someone who reminds you of your younger self. What I remember most, however, has nothing to do with tournaments, nor swordplay, nor quests. No, it was an ordinary evening, the sort of evening no historian would ever think to write down. Supper had ended. The hall buzzed with the comfortable murmur of conversation. A young servant, hardly older than a boy, stumbled while carrying a tray of wooden cups. The cups scattered across the floor. For the briefest moment, everything stopped. Then conversations resumed. Most of us scarcely thought about it. Percival did. Before anyone else had pushed back their chair, he was already kneeling beside the young servant, gathering each cup as though helping him was the most natural thing in the world. No speeches, no grand gesture, no expectation of thanks. He simply saw someone who needed help, so he helped. Strange, isn't it? We remember the dragons, the battles, the shining armor. History has always had an eye for the extraordinary. Yet when I think of Percival, that is the memory my mind returns to. Not because it was remarkable, but because it revealed the man he already was. He noticed people. The stable hand whose back had begun to bend with age. The kitchen maid carrying more than she ought. The lonely guard standing watch through another cold night. He noticed them because he had never learned the habit of looking past them. I believe the world would be gentler if more of us remained that way. The years changed him, of course. They change us all. There were losses, long roads, disappointments, victories that cost more than they first appeared. Each left its mark. Yet none of them stole his kindness. If anything, they rooted it more deeply. One day I looked across the round table and realized the uncertain young man was gone. In his place sat a knight whose quiet confidence filled the room without asking anyone to notice. I could not tell you exactly when the change happened. Perhaps that is the nature of such things. The finest oaks do not become mighty in a single season. You simply wake one morning, look up, and realize they have been growing all along. I was proud of Percival. I believe Arthur was too. Indeed, I think Camelot was proud of him too. For he reminded us that greatness is seldom something a man arrives carrying. More often, It is something patiently uncovered, one faithful day at a time. The fire has settled a little while we've been talking. Go on, warm your hands. These old memories have a way of making an evening pass unnoticed. Now, there is another night I should tell you about. A night unlike any I have ever known. His name was Galahad. People often speak of him as though he was something other than a man. I have never cared for that. He was a man. He laughed. He grew weary after long rides. He enjoyed warm bread fresh from the kitchens. When someone spoke sincerely, he had a curious habit of tilting his head ever so slightly, listening with his whole attention. I can still see him doing it now. No. What made Galahad remarkable was not that he seemed less human. It was that he seemed so completely at peace with being the man he had been called to be. Most of us carry two voices within us. One calls us toward what is right. The other whispers of comfort, pride, or fear. A lifetime is often spent deciding which voice to follow. With Galahad, that struggle seemed strangely quiet. Not because he believed himself better than anyone else. He never did. If anything, he possessed a humility that put the rest of us at ease. I remember lingering in the great hall one evening after everyone else had gone. The candles had nearly burned themselves out. A servant was struggling to move one end of a heavy oak table. Before the young man even thought to ask, Galahad had already taken hold of the opposite side. Together, they carried it into place. They exchanged only a few quiet words. Then Galahad wished him a peaceful night and slipped out into the corridor. I doubt another soul remembered that moment. I never forgot it. Goodness often arrives without fanfare. It asks for no audience. It leaves no monument behind. And yet, it is those quiet acts that seem to endure longest in the memory. Galahad was Lancelot's son. Many wiser men than I have pondered what that means. I shall leave such questions to them. I can only tell you what I saw with my own eyes. I saw a knight whose presence brought calm wherever he went. A man whose faith was steady, whose kindness never seemed rehearsed, whose strength needed no announcement. We all respected him. Many loved him. I certainly did. Even now, after all these years. When I think of Galahad, I do not first remember his victories. I remember the peace that seemed to accompany him wherever he walked. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy any of us can hope to leave behind. Not that people remember our triumphs, but that, for a little while, the world became gentler because we passed through it. I have often hoped I might leave behind even a small measure of that. Whether I have, I cannot say. But I have known men like Percival. I have known men like Galahad, and I count myself fortunate for it. Even now, all these years later, their memory still makes this old hall feel a little less empty. There are evenings I can still hear, if I allow myself to sit quietly enough. Not the conversations. Those have faded with the years. It is the music that remains. The hall would be warm with firelight, supper finished, cups resting upon the table, the worries of the day beginning, at last, to loosen their grip. And then, without ceremony, Tristan would begin to play. He never announced it, never sought anyone's attention. He would simply reach for his instrument as naturally as another man might reach for his cup. Before long, the room itself seemed to change. Conversations softened. Laughter became quieter. Even the fire seemed to listen. I have never possessed the words to describe music properly. Some men can explain why a melody stirs the heart. I cannot. I only know what I witnessed. For a little while, whatever burden a man had carried into the hall seemed lighter when Tristan played. That was his gift. Not merely the music itself, but the peace that followed it. People often describe Tristan as brave. And he was. They speak of his skill with sword and lance. Rightly so. They tell you he was handsome, quick to smile, and possessed of a charm that seemed almost effortless. All of those things are true, yet somehow they never quite reach the man himself. For what I remember most was not how he fought. It was how completely he lived. He laughed easily, perhaps more easily than anyone else at this table. There were times I wondered if he laughed because joy came naturally to him, or because he understood how quickly joy could disappear. The older I grow, the less certain I become. He had a habit of meeting sorrow with a smile, not because he ignored it, but because he refused to let it have the final word. It took me many years to understand that. When I was young, I mistook light-heartedness for ease. Now I know better. Sometimes the brightest souls carry the deepest burdens. Tristan loved completely. His friends, his loyalties, his music, the people entrusted to his heart. He was not a man built for half measures. Everything he gave freely. Everything he loved with his whole heart. Such men often pay dearly for it. I shall not tell that story tonight. Some stories deserve an evening all their own. I will simply say this, even knowing what awaited him, I do not believe Tristan would have chosen a different path. I used to watch him from across this table, sometimes laughing until tears filled his eyes, sometimes staring thoughtfully into the fire as though listening to music the rest of us could not hear. And more than once, I found myself thinking, here is a man who intends to live every note of the song he has been given. Whatever the ending may be, I admired him for that, even when I feared where such a heart might lead him. The world felt brighter when Tristan was in it, when he was gone. You noticed it in ways that were difficult to explain, not all at once, but quietly, like discovering a room has grown colder without ever seeing the door open. There is another chair here that has often held my attention, not because it belonged to the loudest knight or the greatest champion. Quite the opposite. It belonged to Bedivere. When I was younger, I confess I admired the louder men first. The champions, the adventurers, the knights whose names filled every conversation. It took me many years to understand just how fortunate we all were to have Bedivere among us. Loyalty was spoken of often in Camelot. Every knight claimed to value it. Many wore it proudly. Bedivere never spoke of it. He simply lived it, as naturally as breathing. He was not the youngest among us, nor the most celebrated. He did not chase glory with the eagerness of some others. He preferred quieter roads. He listened carefully, thought carefully. And because he measured his words so well, people listened whenever he chose to speak. Not because they were expected to, because they had learned his words were worth waiting for. I remember one winter evening after a campaign that had gone badly. Too many good men had failed to return. Arthur carried that weight more heavily than anyone realized. Most of us noticed. None of us knew how to ease it. Bedivere did not attempt to. He simply walked across the hall, pulled up a chair beside Arthur, and sat with him. No speeches, no advice, no promise that tomorrow would somehow make everything right. Only quiet companionship, the two of them watching the fire together. Looking back, I believe that was one of the kindest things I ever witnessed. There are sorrows that cannot be repaired, only shared. Bedivere understood that better than anyone I have ever known. He taught me something I did not fully appreciate until many years later. Sometimes the greatest comfort we can offer another person is not an answer. It is our presence. The older I become, the more often I find myself thinking about that evening. How easy it is to remain beside someone while life is joyful. How much rarer it is to stay when joy has departed. Bedivere stayed. Again and again. He stayed. And perhaps that is why, of all Arthur's knights, he remained until the very end. I have never believed that was chance. It was simply the truest expression of the man he had always been. Steady, faithful, unmoving when others drifted away. I have sat beside this old table many evenings since those days, trying to gather these memories before time carries them off completely. Some details have faded. Faces blur at the edges. Certain conversations have been lost forever. Yet the feeling remains. The warmth of the fire, the sound of friends laughing together, The quiet comfort of knowing good men filled these chairs. There are still a few empty places around this table, a few more dear friends I'd very much like you to meet. So stay with me a little while longer. The fire is burning low now. Outside, Camelot has settled into silence, and I find I am not quite ready to leave these old memories behind. There is something curious about memory. It does not always return first to the brightest flame. More often, it finds its way back to the steady ones, the people who were simply always there. That is how it has always been with Kay. If you wish to understand Camelot, you must first understand this. Kay belonged to its story before there was a Camelot to belong to, before the Round Table, before the banners, before kings and knights and songs. There was simply a young Arthur, and beside him, there was Kay. They had grown up together, foster brothers, which meant Kay knew Arthur in a way none of us ever could. Most people first came to know Arthur as a king. Kay knew him as the boy who scraped his knees climbing trees, the boy who laughed too loudly when he thought of something funny, the boy who lost his temper from time to time, then felt ashamed of it afterward. You cannot know someone from the beginning without seeing them differently for the rest of your life. Kay never forgot who Arthur had been. I do not believe Arthur ever wanted him to. Kay was not an easy man. I say that with affection. He could be blunt, impatient, stubborn enough to wear down a stone wall if given enough time. There were younger knights who found him intimidating. Some mistook his sharpness for unkindness. I confess. When I was younger, there were moments I thought the same. The years have a curious way of correcting such misunderstandings. Age teaches you the difference between a hard man and an honest one. Kay was honest, painfully so at times. He had long since stopped worrying about whether people liked him. He cared far more about whether they became better men. I remember a bright afternoon in the training yard. A young knight had arrived only a few days before. Strong, quick, entirely convinced that youth possessed all the answers experience had somehow overlooked. He made an unwise remark about the older knights. Kay heard every word. He looked at the young fellow for a moment, said nothing, then returned to his work. I remember thinking that was the end of it. It was not. A few mornings later, the same young knight found himself paired against Kay in a training bout. It did not last long. Kay was never cruel, but he had a remarkable talent for allowing a man to discover his own mistakes. When it was over, he offered the young knight a hand and helped him to his feet. The two of them spoke quietly for a moment. I could not hear what was said, whatever those few words were. The young man listened far more than he spoke from that day forward. That was Kay. He preferred lessons that stayed with you. Beneath all that rough bark, there was a heart more loyal than most ever realized. He loved Arthur fiercely, not with grand speeches, not with embraces, simply by being there, again, and again, and again. Some men say, "You may depend on me." Kay never felt the need. He simply showed up, every time. It is fitting, I think, that the next chair should belong to Gareth. For in many ways, Gareth helped me understand Kay better. When Gareth first arrived, he asked for nothing more than the chance to prove himself. No titles, no special treatment, only the opportunity to earn his place. I admired him for that from the very beginning. Not everyone shared my confidence. Kay certainly did not. He watched Gareth with the careful eye of a man who had seen youthful promise fade before. He was slow to give his approval, very slow. Gareth never seemed offended by it. He did not argue. He did not complain. He simply went about his work, day after day, morning after morning, steady as the turning of the seasons. He reminded me a little of water flowing over stone, never hurried, never boastful, yet impossible to stop. There was a gentleness about Gareth that surprised many people. He possessed great skill, but he wore it lightly. He never seemed interested in proving himself the finest knight in the room, only in becoming a better man than he had been yesterday. Those are not always the same thing. I watched him change over the years, not suddenly, Not dramatically, quietly, like watching a fire catch properly after someone has opened the chimney. The flame had always been there. It simply needed room to breathe. Then came the day Kay finally spoke the words Gareth had spent years earning. It happened so quickly that most of the hall scarcely noticed. Training had ended. The yard was beginning to empty. Kay walked past Gareth, paused, rested a hand upon his shoulder, and said only, "Well done, lad." Then he kept walking. That was all. No ceremony, no applause, no audience. I looked toward Gareth. He tried very hard not to smile. He failed completely. I do not believe I ever saw him stand quite so tall. Funny, isn't it? Some praise echoes more loudly because it is given so sparingly. The older I become, the more I find myself thinking about those two men. One who expected much, the other who never stopped trying to become worthy of those expectations. Together, they taught me something I have carried all my life. A man's beginning tells you very little. His willingness to keep showing up tells you almost everything. The fire has settled lower while we've been talking. Listen, the hall has grown wonderfully quiet. Most of the candles have burned down now. Only a few remain. There is one more night I'd very much like you to meet before we leave this hall. History does not speak of him as often as it should. Yet whenever I think back upon these days, his face is never very far from my mind. His name was Lamorak. His name was Lamorak. I have always found it strange that history has not been kinder to his memory. He deserved better than to be mentioned only in passing. I remember him clearly. More clearly, perhaps, than some knights whose names are far better known. He was not loud. That was the first thing you noticed about him, if you were paying attention at all. In a hall full of men who often drew attention without quite meaning to, Lamorak simply did not. He would sit, listen, speak when he had something worth saying, and when he had nothing to add, he was perfectly content to let the conversation move past him. Some men need to be seen in order to feel they exist. Lamorak was not built that way. He seemed entirely comfortable simply being. I used to wonder in those early years whether that quietness meant he lacked something. Ambition, perhaps, or fire. I was wrong. I learned how wrong on a night I still think about more than I probably should. We had been caught in a skirmish none of us had expected. The kind that arrives suddenly, out of darkness, with no warning and no time to prepare. Men shouting, horses panicking, steel flashing where, only moments before, there had been nothing but night. The particular chaos that swallows a battlefield when no one yet understands the shape of the danger. I remember feeling fear rise in my own chest. Sharp, immediate, the kind of fear that makes a man's hands forget what they are holding. And then I saw Lamorak. He was utterly still, not frozen, not uncertain. Still in the way a deep lake is still, calm on the surface because of all the weight resting beneath it. He moved through that chaos as though he had already seen its ending and only needed to walk toward it. Methodical, unhurried, entirely certain. I have never forgotten that stillness. It was not the absence of fear. I do not believe Lamorak was without fear. No man truly is, whatever the old songs may claim. It was something closer to mastery over it. Some private understanding he had made with his own nature, long before I ever knew him. Afterward, when the danger had passed and the rest of us were still catching our breath, still shaking the fear out of our hands, Lamorak simply helped tend to the wounded, quietly, without comment, as though what he had done required no acknowledgement at all. I tried to thank him once. He waved it away the way a man might wave away a compliment about the weather, as though it was simply a fact of the day, nothing more. That was Lamorak. He did not perform his courage. He simply carried it, the way some men carry steady hands, or a clear voice, or a heart that does not easily bend. It was not a costume he put on for the benefit of others. It was simply the shape of him beneath everything else. Looking back now, across all these years, I think men like Lamorak are easy to overlook, precisely because they make no effort to be seen. The songs remember the knights who rode out boldly, who announced themselves before battle, who were celebrated after it. They remember less often the ones who simply did what needed doing, then quietly returned to their seats as though nothing remarkable had happened at all. But I remember him. I remember the stillness. I remember that night when the rest of us were afraid, and he was not. Or if he was, he carried it somewhere we could not see. I think the truest measure of a man is not how he behaves when the room is watching. It is how he behaves when no one is. Lamorak passed that measure every time I ever saw him tested. Every single time. There were not many of us who could say the same with such certainty. I think of him often. More often, perhaps, than the old stories would suggest I should. But I have lived long enough to know that the world rarely keeps its accounting straight. The loudest names are not always the ones that deserve to echo longest. Some of the finest men I have known left the smallest footprint behind them. Lamorak was one of those men, and I am grateful, at least, that I am still here to tell you about him. Someone should be. The hour is growing late now. I can feel it in the quiet of this hall, in the way the silence has thickened, in the way the fire has settled into its slow and steady burn. But there is one more man I must tell you about before the night is through. One whose chair sits at the center of every memory I have shared tonight. Though he would tell you, every time, that there is no center here, no head of this table, only a circle, and a king who chose to be no more than an equal part of it. Come, let me tell you about Arthur. There is one more knight I would like you to meet before we come to Arthur. His name was Bors. I have often wondered why his name is spoken less frequently than so many others. For the life of me, I have never found a satisfying answer. Perhaps it is because Bors never gave anyone a reason to speak loudly about him. Not because there was nothing remarkable to say, but because he never arranged his life to be noticed. He was not the strongest knight at this table. He would have admitted that himself without the slightest trace of disappointment. He was not the quickest, nor the most celebrated. Young squires rarely dreamed of becoming Bors. They dreamed of becoming Lancelot, or Tristan, or Gawain. That is simply the way of young hearts. But as the years passed, I noticed something. When difficult work needed doing, someone always went to find Bors. Not because he was the greatest, because he could be depended upon every single time. That is rarer than most people realize. It is easy to admire greatness. Greatness has a way of announcing itself. Steady goodness is quieter. It often looks like nothing more than a man doing the right thing on an ordinary afternoon when no one is watching and no reward will ever follow. That was Bors. When I think of him, I do not remember one great deed. I remember 100 small ones. The forgotten meal quietly placed before a servant who had worked through supper. The nervous young knight invited to sit among friends before loneliness had the chance to settle in. The weary stable hand finding someone had already finished the task he thought still awaited him. Little things, the sort historians rarely bother writing down. Yet I have come to believe the world is built far more upon little things than great ones. There was one evening when several younger knights found themselves arguing over some small matter that had grown much larger than it deserved. Voices rose. Pride rose with them. The hall had begun to grow uncomfortable. Bors did not raise his own voice. He simply stepped between them, smiled gently, and asked each man, one at a time, "What is it you're hoping comes of this?" Such an ordinary question. Yet the room became quiet almost at once. The anger slowly slipped away, not because Bors had won an argument, but because he had reminded everyone what they had forgotten, that they were brothers before they were opponents. I do not believe Bors ever thought of that as wisdom. To him, it was simply common sense. Sometimes I wonder whether those two things are closer than we imagine. He kept his word, always. in small matters as faithfully as large ones. If he promised to meet you at sunrise, he would already be waiting when you arrived. If he said he would see something through, you never thought to ask again. You simply knew it would be done. There is a particular kind of trust that grows around a man like that, not the dramatic sort earned in battle, the quieter kind, the kind that becomes part of the furniture of your life. So constant, so dependable, that you scarcely notice it until one day it is no longer there. The older I become, the more I think every kingdom needs far more bosses than Lancelot's. The songs may belong to the heroes, but ordinary days belong to faithful men. And ordinary days, after all, are what most of life is made of. Bors understood that. Whether he ever realized it, I cannot say. He never asked to be remembered, never sought praise, never expected applause. He simply went on doing what was right, one quiet day after another. Perhaps that is why I wished to tell you about him tonight. For I have lived long enough to believe that the finest people are not always the ones history remembers most clearly. Sometimes they are simply the ones everyone quietly depended upon. And Camelot was stronger because Bors sat at this table. I have never doubted that. There is only one chair left now. Strange. After all these years, I still find myself looking toward it before any other. Come, sit with me a little longer. I'd like to tell you about Arthur. There is only one chair left now. Strange. After all these years, I still find myself looking toward it before any other. Not because it was grander than the rest. There was nothing grand about it. Arthur would never have allowed that. It was simply his place among his friends. I have told you about a great many men tonight, each one different, each one worthy of remembrance for his own reasons. But I have saved this one for last. I imagine by now you already understand why. For to speak of Arthur is, in many ways, to speak of all the others at once. Without him, there would have been no Round Table, no brotherhood, no Camelot as we came to know it. Before I go any further, I should tell you something honestly. It is difficult to speak of Arthur without slipping into the language of legend. The historians do it, the poets even more so. After enough years have passed, people begin polishing a man's memory until the man himself almost disappears beneath it. I have never wished to do that. I knew Arthur. I would much rather tell you about the man than the legend. He was younger than most people imagine, far younger, and in those first years, far less certain than the stories would have you believe. I remember noticing that uncertainty the first time I saw it. You expect a king to wear his crown as naturally as he wears his sword, without hesitation, without question. Arthur never wore it that way, not because he doubted the kingdom, because he understood the weight of it. Even then, he knew he was attempting something the world had rarely seen. A kingdom built not upon fear, but trust, not upon rank, but brotherhood. A circle where good men could speak freely, challenge one another honestly, and leave the room respecting one another more than when they had entered. It was a remarkable thing to believe. And I suspect there were evenings when it must have felt like a lonely belief indeed. Arthur rarely spoke of his doubts, yet if you watched carefully, you could sometimes see them. Long after supper had ended, long after the laughter had faded, he would remain here beside the table, not at the head of it. There was no head, only his place among the others. He would rest one hand upon the old oak and slowly trace the grain beneath his fingertips, as though searching for an answer hidden somewhere inside the wood. One evening, I found him carrying 2 empty pitchers back toward the kitchens. I laughed and asked whether kings had begun serving drinks now. He smiled without breaking his stride. Only when everyone else has forgotten to. Then he disappeared through the doorway, as though there had been nothing unusual about it. That was Arthur. The crown never seemed to excuse him from ordinary kindness. Years later, I asked him whether he had ever regretted building Camelot as he had. A round table, no seat above another, a kingdom where even a knight might question his king and expect to be heard. He was quiet for a long while before answering. Then he told me something I have never forgotten. A king who cannot be questioned eventually forgets how to question himself. He smiled after saying it, not because he found it clever, because he knew how difficult it was to live by. He would rather be challenged by good men, and occasionally proven wrong, than spend his life surrounded by men too frightened to tell him the truth. That was Arthur, not a perfect king. I should say that plainly. Perfection had very little to do with what made him remarkable. He made mistakes, some of them costly, some of them heartbreaking. There were nights when I watched him carry those burdens alone after everyone else had gone to bed. Time did not seem to lighten them. If anything, he carried them more carefully with each passing year. A lesser man might have hidden from such failures. Arthur never did. He believed a man ought to own his mistakes as honestly as his victories. Looking back now, I think that required more courage than many battles ever demanded. Yet when I remember Arthur, it is not councils of war that come first to mind, nor victories, nor crowns. I remember his laughter, full, unrestrained, the laughter of a man who had, for just a few precious moments, forgotten the weight he carried. I remember him asking after the health of a stable-hand's mother, weeks after she had fallen ill. I remember him thanking the cooks before leaving the hall each evening. I remember the way his eyes wandered around this table on peaceful nights. Not with pride, something gentler than pride, gratitude, as though he could scarcely believe his good fortune in being surrounded by such remarkable people. He loved this table. He loved these men, every one of them, not because they were the greatest knights in Britain, but because they had chosen, day after day, to become good men together. To Arthur, that mattered far more. He believed with his whole heart that ordinary people were capable of becoming better than the world expected of them. He built an entire kingdom upon that hope, and for a little while, against all odds, he was right. I have often wondered what became of Camelot, not the stone walls. Stone always finds a way to outlive the people who raise it. I mean, its spirit, its kindness, its loyalty, its quiet belief that good people, gathered together with honest purpose, could leave the world better than they found it. Perhaps it never truly disappeared. Perhaps it simply waits. Wherever people choose truth over pride, kindness over power, brotherhood over themselves. I like to think Arthur would have smiled at that thought. I know I do. The fire has burned low. The candles have nearly reached their end. Yet standing here beside this old table, after remembering each of them once more, I cannot help but feel these chairs are not quite so empty as they were when we first arrived. Strange, isn't it? How memory can do that. And for that, I am deeply grateful. Come, let us leave them be for a little while. These chairs, this old table, this quiet hall that has held so many evenings like the one we have just shared. I find, the older I become, that it is good to visit old memories, and just as good to leave them where they belong. Come, our walk is not a long one. Let us make our way back, together. The great doors close softly behind us. Their familiar weight settles into the silence without so much as an echo. The corridor beyond is quieter than I remember. The torches have burned lower while we were inside. Their flames glow amber now instead of gold. Soft, unhurried. The sort of light that asks nothing of a traveller except to keep walking toward rest. Listen. Our footsteps are the only sound. Even this old castle seems to have settled more deeply into its sleep while we were remembering. There, through the window. The courtyard lies beneath the moon, just as it did when we first arrived this evening. The fountain still sings its gentle song. The water never seems to grow tired of telling it. For a moment, the cool night air drifts through the open archway. It carries with it the faint scent of the herb garden we wandered through earlier. Lavender, rosemary, a touch of mint. The evening dew has settled upon the leaves now. Everything feels wonderfully still. We continue on, past the familiar suits of armour standing faithfully along the wall, past windows where the stars keep their quiet watch above Camelot, past the places where old memories seem content simply to remain. I have always loved this walk. There is something peaceful about leaving the Great Hall after an evening like this. Not because I wish to leave it behind, but because it reminds me that the finest moments of our lives do not end when we walk away from them. They travel with us, quietly, sometimes for the rest of our days. I have often wondered what became of the lessons those good men taught me. Perhaps they still live wherever people choose kindness over pride, loyalty over convenience, truth over comfort. Perhaps Camelot was never merely a place. Perhaps it has always been something carried in the hearts of ordinary people, trying each day to become just a little better than they were the day before. I rather hope that is true. Ah, there it is, the fire, still burning, still waiting for us exactly as we left it. Come, sit down once more. Hold your hands toward the warmth. The embers have settled into that deep orange glow that always seems to arrive just before the night grows quietest. Thank you, traveller. Thank you for spending this evening beside the fire with an old knight. It has been a great comfort to remember these good people once more. Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, Galahad, Tristan, Bedivere, Kay, Gareth, Lamorak, Bors, and Arthur. For a little while tonight, they did not feel so very far away. Neither, I hope, did Camelot. The fire has burned low, the castle is asleep. The stars keep their watch above the towers, just as they have for centuries. And I think it is time that we did the same. Rest well, traveller. Sleep peacefully. Camelot will still be here when next you return, and if these old memories are willing, so will I. Good night to the good knights, and good night to Camelot.